The call came at 2:37 in the morning, and I almost didn't answer it. I'd been asleep maybe 3 hours, still in my work clothes, my phone face down on the nightstand. I'd had a long shift, my back hurt, and I remember thinking whoever it was could wait until morning. But something made me reach for it, some reflex I can't explain. The number wasn't saved. Area code I recognized, my hometown 2 states away. I sat up. Hello? Silence. Then breathing. Small shallow breathing. Hello? Who is this? Uncle. The voice was so quiet I almost missed it. It's me. My chest dropped. It was my niece. She was 7 years old, and she was whispering like she was afraid someone would hear her. Hey, I'm here. What's wrong? Where are you? I'm at Grandma and Grandpa's house. A pause. A sniff. I'm really hungry. And I don't know where they went. I've been by myself since yesterday. I was already standing up, already looking for my keys. Let me back up, because you need to understand how we got here. My older brother, her father, had been struggling for years. He'd started with pills after a car accident when he was 26, and by the time his daughter was born, the problem was already bigger than he wanted to admit. He and her mother split when the baby was 2. Her mother moved to Oregon for work, remarried, started a new life. She wasn't cruel about it. She just wasn't present. My niece saw her maybe twice a year. So my parents stepped in. They volunteered. They told my brother they'd take her while he got treatment, got stable, got back on his feet. They made it sound generous. Temporary. A bridge. My brother signed over guardianship and checked into a facility in Phoenix. That was 8 months before that phone call. I want to be honest about my parents, because this is hard to say out loud. I didn't see it coming. Not really. I'd noticed things. The way my dad talked about the arrangement like it was an inconvenience. The way my mom sometimes referred to my niece as your brother's mess. But I told myself that was just how they talked. That underneath it, they loved her. That grandparents don't do what I was about to find out they'd been doing. I grew up in that house. I know what it looks like from the outside. Nice neighborhood, 2-car garage, the kind of place where neighbors wave at each other. My parents kept it immaculate. They went to church on Sundays. They smiled at school events. What they were doing in private was something else entirely. I drove 4 hours that night, straight through, no stops except for gas. I called my niece back twice to check on her. The second time, she told me she'd found some crackers in the pantry and eaten those. She said she was okay. She said it in the way kids say they're okay when they absolutely aren't. That careful flat voice children use when they've learned not to make too much noise about being in pain. I asked her where my parents were. She said she didn't know. She said they'd left the night before and told her to stay in her room and not answer the door. She was 7. She'd been alone in that house for over 24 hours. I pulled into the driveway at 6:15 in the morning. The house looked the same as it always had. Flowers in the front beds. Curtains drawn. A little garden gnome my mother had bought at a craft fair, still standing by the mailbox like nothing was wrong. I knocked. Nothing. I knocked harder. I tried my old key. They'd changed the lock since I'd last visited. My neighbor from across the street came out to get her paper. I recognized her. She lived there since I was in middle school. I waved and she walked over, and before I could say anything, she said, "I'm glad someone finally came." She'd seen things. Over the past few months, she'd noticed that my niece was outside less and less, that she looked thin, that once, she'd seen her sitting on the back porch steps at dusk, not playing, just sitting. She'd thought about calling someone. She hadn't known who to call. She told me my parents had left the previous afternoon in my dad's car. She hadn't seen them come back. I went around to the side of the house and found a window in the laundry room that had never latched properly, not in 30 years. I pushed it open and climbed through. The house smelled stale. The kitchen was clean but empty, refrigerator nearly bare, a half-eaten box of crackers on the counter. I called my niece's name as I walked down the hall. She was in the small bedroom at the back of the house. The door was closed. I opened it and she was sitting on the bed with her knees pulled to her chest and a stuffed rabbit held tight against her. And when she saw me, she didn't run to me the way kids usually run. She just looked at me for a second like she was making sure I was real. Then she got up and walked over and put her arms around my waist and held on. I stood there in that room and I held her back, and I looked around at what they'd given her. A small bed with a thin blanket. No toys on the shelves. No drawings on the walls. The room was clean, but it felt stripped, like a place where someone was being kept rather than a place where a child was being raised. I looked at her face, the shadows under her eyes, the way her clothes hung loose. I picked her up, and she was lighter than she should have been. I called my brother first. Voicemail. I called the facility in Phoenix. They told me he was still enrolled, that he was making progress, that they couldn't give me more information. I left a message saying it was urgent. Then I drove my niece to a diner and ordered her the biggest breakfast on the menu. She ate scrambled eggs and toast and half a stack of pancakes. She ate like someone who had been rationing themselves. When the food came, she didn't speak for several minutes, just ate carefully, like she wasn't sure it would stay. I watched her, and I kept my face neutral, because she was watching me too, checking my reaction, and I didn't want to scare her by looking as horrified as I felt. When she slowed down, I asked her to tell me what things had been like. She told me about the room, about how she wasn't allowed in most of the house after dinner, about how she'd stopped going to school 3 weeks ago. My parents had told her she was taking a break. About how some nights dinner was crackers and peanut butter. About how she'd heard my grandparents talking about money, and about something called the account, and about her dad. I asked her what they said about the account. She thought about it. Grandpa said it was for him now. Because he was taking care of me. I went cold. My brother had a life insurance policy from our grandfather, a small trust that had transferred to him, and then, when he signed guardianship over, had apparently been redirected. I didn't know the details yet, but I was already starting to understand the shape of what had happened. I called the family attorney that morning, a woman named... Well, she told me later I could call her my lawyer, and for the purposes of this story that's enough. She'd handled child custody cases for 15 years. I explained the situation as fast and clearly as I could, sitting in the parking lot of the diner while my niece slept in the back seat. She told me what I needed to do. Document everything. Photograph the room. Get my niece seen by a doctor as soon as possible. File for emergency temporary custody that day if I could. I did all of it. The pediatrician who examined my niece that afternoon was quiet for a long time after the checkup. She said my niece was underweight, significantly. She said there were signs of prolonged nutritional neglect. She said she was required by law to file a report with Child Protective Services. She said it gently, looking at me, making sure I understood she wasn't accusing me. I told her I understood. I told her I was the one who'd brought her in. I asked her to file it. CPS opened a case within the day. My parents came home that evening to find me sitting in their living room with a folder of documents and a CPS caseworker waiting with me. My father walked in first. He stopped when he saw me. His face went through several things in quick succession. Surprise, calculation, then a careful kind of blankness. "This is a misunderstanding," he said. He hadn't even asked where my niece was. My mother stood behind him and said nothing. I didn't argue with them. My lawyer had told me not to get into a fight that night. I let the caseworker lead the conversation. I sat there and I looked at my parents, people I'd known my entire life, people I'd believed in, and I tried to find something I recognized. The next few weeks were the hardest I've lived through. My parents hired a lawyer. They framed it as a family dispute, said I was interfering, said my brother had wanted them to have full control, said my niece was well cared for, and I'd shown up in the middle of the night and frightened her with my overreaction. Their attorney was good. He had a way of making everything sound reasonable. But documentation is harder to argue with than testimony. The photographs of her room, her medical records going back to when they'd taken guardianship, healthy weight at the start, steady decline over 8 months. The school's attendance records showing she'd been pulled out with no explanation, no homeschool enrollment filed, text messages I found. My dad had sent one to a number I didn't recognize that said, "She won't need to go back. We're handling it here." A financial forensics contact my attorney brought in found that the trust my grandfather had left had been nearly drained over 7 months. Expenses listed as childcare, housing, medical, all in a period during which my niece had seen a doctor exactly once. It was worse than I'd thought. It was calculated. I had my niece with me during all of this. She was staying at my apartment, sleeping in my bed while I took the couch. She started eating normally again within a week. Color came back to her face. She started drawing again. She used to love drawing, and she'd stopped. One afternoon, I came home and she'd covered 3 pages in crayon drawings of animals and houses, and what she said was, "Our new place." I tacked them to the refrigerator. My brother called on a Tuesday afternoon. He'd gotten my messages. His voice was different than I remembered. Slower, steadier. He'd been clean for 4 months. He was scared. He cried when I told him what had been happening to his daughter while he was in treatment, trusting his parents to protect her. "I thought they loved her," he said. I didn't know what to say to that. I thought they did too. He asked if he could talk to her. I put her on. She said, "Daddy," and he lost it, and I stepped out of the room and stood in the hallway and stared at the wall for a while. The custody hearing was scheduled 6 weeks after I'd first driven through the night to get her. I want to tell you, it felt like a sure thing by then. It didn't. My parents' attorney had filed counter documentation, affidavits from people at their church saying what wonderful, devoted grandparents they were. A statement from my dad claiming I had a history of instability and poor judgment. There was a moment 2 days before the hearing when my attorney called me and said we needed to talk through some scenarios, and her voice was careful in a way that made my stomach drop. I couldn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning, and my niece padded out in her pajamas and climbed into the chair next to me and leaned her head against my arm without saying anything. We sat there like that for a while. "Are they going to make me go back?" she asked. "I'm doing everything I can to make sure you don't have to," I said. She thought about that. "I know," she said. Then she went back to bed. I don't know how she trusted me as much as she did. I hadn't been there when I should have been. I believed my parents were taking care of her. I'd visited twice in 8 months. Told myself I was giving them space. Told myself she was fine. Those were the thoughts that kept me up at night in a different way than the legal fears. The ones I had to sit with. The day of the hearing, I wore my one good suit and I sat next to my attorney and I watched the judge review the documentation. She was a woman in her 50s, reading glasses low on her nose, and she read slowly. She asked questions. Sharp ones. She asked my parents' attorney why the child had been withdrawn from school. He said it had been a temporary decision made in the child's best interest due to a difficult transition period. The judge looked at him for a moment over her glasses and then looked back at her papers. She asked about the trust fund. She asked about the expenses. She asked very specifically about the medical records showing the child's weight decline and the absence of any documented medical care during that period. My father tried to answer one of the questions directly, and his attorney put a hand on his arm. The judge issued her preliminary ruling that afternoon. Emergency temporary custody to me, pending full review. My parents were ordered to have no unsupervised contact. A full forensic financial audit was to be conducted on the trust account. The case was referred to the county district attorney's office for review of potential criminal charges. My attorney squeezed my arm. I exhaled for what felt like the first time in 6 weeks. The financial audit took another 2 months. What it found was methodical, not a spontaneous theft, but a deliberate restructuring. My parents had had paperwork drawn up quietly through an attorney they'd used for years, redirecting disbursements from the trust into a joint account in their names. The listed justification was guardian compensation and child care expenses. Over 8 months, they had taken more than $60,000. $60,000. While their granddaughter ate crackers for dinner and lost 12% of her body weight. The district attorney filed charges. Felony financial exploitation of a dependent. Child neglect. Falsification of records. My parents were arrested on a Tuesday morning. I know because my neighbor across the street texted me a photo of the police cars in the driveway. She said she'd been waiting for that day. Their bail was set and they paid it. They were out within a day. Their trial was still months away when this story ends, but their attorney had already begun plea negotiations, and the DA told mine that they were looking at mandatory restitution and almost certainly prison time, given the documentation. The family home, the one I grew up in, with the garden gnome and the flower beds, had a lien placed on it as part of the asset recovery process. I won't pretend that felt good exactly. It felt necessary. It felt like the only honest ending to what they had done. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't sit in my car after my attorney told me and feel something heavy move through me that I still don't have a clean word for. Grief, maybe. For the version of my family that had turned out never to have existed. For my brother, who was still in treatment, who had trusted the people who raised him to protect his child. For my niece, who had called me at 2047 in the morning because she had no one else and she had somehow, despite everything, believed I would come. She's been with me for over a year now. My brother completed his program in Phoenix. He's got a job, a small apartment, 18 months clean. He sees her every other weekend and twice during the week, and watching the two of them together is one of the few things lately that makes me feel like things can be repaired. She lights up when he comes. She runs to the door. The court formalized my guardianship, and we've begun a slow process, with a family therapist involved, at my attorney's recommendation, of building toward a future where she can live primarily with her father when he's ready. There's no rush. She's doing well in school. She joined a soccer league. She has friends now, a best friend who calls the apartment looking for her at least twice a week. Some nights she still sleeps with the light on. Some mornings she hoards food. Little things, crackers, an apple, tucked into the corner of her room. I don't take them away. The therapist said not to, that it's her security, that it'll fade as she learns she doesn't need it. I buy extra crackers and put them where she can reach them. Last week I was doing dishes, and she came and stood in the kitchen doorway and said, "I have a question." I turned off the water. "Okay. Are you going to keep me?" She asked it very matter-of-factly, like she was asking about the weather. I dried my hands. I looked at her. She was looking at me with that steady, serious expression she gets sometimes, the one that's too old for her face. "Yes," I said, "for as long as you need." She nodded like this confirmed something she'd already suspected. Then she went back to her drawing. I stood there in the kitchen for a minute by myself, and I thought about the drive through the dark 4 hours with my hands tight on the wheel, and the window in the laundry room that still didn't latch, and the way she'd looked when she'd seen me standing in that doorway, making sure I was real before she let herself move. I chose her. I choose her again every single time. I keep coming back to the crackers. Not the courtroom, not the audit numbers, not the lien on the house I grew up in. Just the crackers. A half-eaten box on the counter, and a 7-year-old who'd rationed them out for herself because no one else was going to. That image is what stays. That's the one that tells me everything I need to know about what happened and why. There's a version of this story where I don't answer the phone, where I see an unknown number at 2047 in the morning and I roll over and let it go to voicemail. It would have been easy. Reasonable even. I was tired. I didn't know what was waiting. And the truth is, for a second, I thought about it. I think about that second a lot now. What I've learned, the hard way, the only way some things can actually be learned, is that doing right isn't always loud. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up at 2:47 a.m. as a small voice on the other end of a phone call, and it asks you a question you don't have time to think about. You either answer or you don't. You either go or you stay in bed. My parents made their choices quietly too, not in one dramatic moment, but in dozens of small ones. A redirect here, a withdrawal there, a little girl pulled from school, a door that stayed closed. Each decision on its own probably felt manageable, justifiable. That's how people talk themselves into the kind of thing that eventually ends in handcuffs and a forensic audit. Not in one leap, but in steps. That's the thing about moral choices. They compound. The good ones and the bad ones both. My parents had spent years being the kind of people who made small, self-serving decisions, and by the time it mattered, that pattern had calcified into something they couldn't walk back from. And I had spent years being the kind of person who showed up when called, who didn't look away, who believed, maybe naively, that family meant something real. When the moment came, I moved. Not because I was brave. Because I'd practiced being that person without knowing I was practicing. My brother is 18 months clean now. He calls his daughter twice a week and drives to see her every other weekend, and watching him rebuild that relationship, carefully and perfectly with full awareness of what he missed, is one of the most honest things I've ever witnessed. He doesn't pretend the time was nothing. He sits in it. He does the work anyway. That's not a small thing. That takes something most people underestimate, the intelligence to understand what you've lost, and the spine to keep going after you understand it. My niece asked me recently if she could keep some extra snacks in her room, I said yes before she finished the sentence. She's starting to trust that the food will be there tomorrow. That I'll be there tomorrow. That's not a given for a kid who learned early that the people responsible for her could simply leave. Trust like that doesn't come from a single grand gesture. It comes from showing up the same way, over and over, until the pattern becomes something she can stand on. That's what I want her to carry into her life. Not just that she was rescued, but that she's worth showing up for. That she has the right to ask for help. And that when the time comes for her to be the person who answers the phone at 2047 a.m. for someone she loves, she'll already know how, because she learned it by watching. The crackers are still there. I keep buying them. I put them where she can reach.